The culture is important, especially the year we had the war between punk, rock, and disco music, so that I featured that.
Well, I know where I stand.
Myself as well, oddly enough.
Polarizing.
Are we on the same side of an issue for once?
No, I don't think so.
Welcome to Pod Keep Our Land. It's what?
Evelyn Lett
would have listened to. We are a show about Canadian politics, parliaments, politicians, the patriarchy, student politics, policy, etc. I'm Erin Rennie.
I'm Patrick Meehan.
And I'm Matthew Naylor.
It is January 28th, 2018. We're podcasting from Vancouver, BC, and we have a great show for you tonight. Later on, we have a wonderful interview with Sheldon Goldfarb about his new book, The 100-Year Trek, A History of Student Life at UBC. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the crazy news of the week, you guys.
Oh my god. Tory leaders are dropping like flies, although one of them...
I think it's more just men.
But in fairness, 3 Tory leaders are gone over the past week. Admittedly, one of them had planned on stepping down several months in advance, but there is a period of turnover in the Conservative movement leadership at the moment, as not only Brad Wall departs his long and relatively successful tenure in Saskatchewan, but also Patrick Brown, the Ontario Progressive Conservative leader, and Jamie Bailey, the Progressive Conservative leader of Nova Scotia's...
both of whom were forced out.
Yes, were forced out
over
after...
sexual harassment allegations.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then we also have Minister Kent Hare has stepped down pending, stepped down from his cabinet position pending investigation into sexual harassment allegations as well.
And apparently, as of today, new allegations have come forward from more women regarding Kent Hare, and some of them apparently have to do with his time as a member of parliament even.
There's been a sexism problem in Canada's politics since Canada started. These allegations shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but they are. And it's really interesting to see the reaction to these 3 men stepping down. A lot of people are treating this like it's quite a shock. And I think it shouldn't come as a shock to anybody because we've been seeing this growing movement around calling out perpetrators of sexual harassment and sexual assault on our campuses, in the workplace, in our homes, and at last it's coming to Canadian politics, and it's really refreshing to see. I had the opportunity to talk about this issue of rape culture in Canada's politics on a great show, Politicoast, this week. Do check out that show. It was really fun to talk to Ian and Scott about sexism in politics. Wondering if you guys had any thoughts on this issue.
I think for me, it's something that, as soon as metoo and its time erupted in the States, and as soon as it hit Hollywood and started moving around, it's always been the sort of waiting for the shoe to drop for it to hit politics in Canada, because like you said, we all know it's there. We've all heard about it, as they said with the Kent Hare allegation, this whisper campaign of people warning people off from politicians has been around for years. And we've talked about it on this show in the past, and I'm really sad that we have to be here in this place, but I'm really happy that we're here in this place where it's happening, and where men that have been harassers and assaulters and just predators in the legislatures, our highest and most important buildings in the land, are no longer safe from consequences. And I think this is great, but also it's so sad that it has to happen.
It's always a gut punch when allegations come out about someone who you respect and admire and have worked for or canvassed for. And I liked Kent Hare, and I, will reserve judgment until, the smoke clears and the dust settles a little bit. But, the things that I have heard so far, I do not like. It's something that bears remembering that these systems of power, this harassment, is very much about power, and it is about people wielding sexual power and the power established through a patriarchal system in order to exert power over other people. And so I do want to remind the amount of guys out there who aren't sexually harassing anyone, this whole thing isn't not about you. It is about trying to correct a power system that is not only harassing your female colleagues, but also keeping you down because, you have an interest in an egalitarian and fair workplace. And the fact that you aren't directly impacted by the actual harassment harassment doesn't mean that you aren't directly impacted or that you aren't tangentially impacted by a system of harassment.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that these three stories has really made me think about is how there isn't a lot of great opportunities for recourse for survivors or alleged victims or whatever you want to call them. If your employer is a politician, they are your direct boss and supervisor, but they are also your HR management. So if that person is also harassing you in some way, you have no recourse, because if you want to pursue a political career, your entire future is in that person's hands. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't hear more stories of people coming forward and saying, this happened to me, it wasn't right, it wasn't fair, I want justice to be served. So it's really interesting and great to see people paying attention to this. And before we go any further, I do want to acknowledge and just say, respect to those women who have come forward with these allegations. That takes courage, and it's difficult, and it's a brave thing to do.
Yeah, and they shouldn't face any consequences. They shouldn't face any blowback, and it's to me so depressing that some of them are. And I hope that we as a society can get better about that and respect the women that do come forward. But I think one of the things that I was going to say too was that, we always lament how few women there are in politics. Well, I mean, if the place isn't safe for them, they're not going to be there. And I think that's a key thing, is making sure that we're ensuring that there's a safe place in politics. And I thought back, and it was something that only occurred to me just recently, was I had a friend of mine, and I'm not going to mention the political party that we were involved with, because I think this is an endemic issue in all political parties. And she had gotten really deeply involved in a leadership race for the federal party that had occurred years and years ago, and she got really interested in it. She supported this candidate. This candidate won, became leader of the party. And at the party convention, she ran into him, and he winked at her and said, "So you're going to be creating more young blank babies this weekend?" And said, basically, are you going to be going out and having lots of sex with all the men at convention this weekend? And she never went back to another convention. She never stayed involved in that party because she was so turned off by the idea that this leader that she had campaigned for and worked for would say that to her, and how abysmally awful that is. And that's, I think that whole culture of sexism and the gender dynamic leads into giving a safe place for these men to do what they're doing. But also, even if we get rid of that element, you still have to get rid of this engendered sexualization and sexual sort of like gendered lens that exists in parliaments and provincial parliaments.
And in defense of that person, that leader of the particular party, maybe, because there's a lot of blind spots in politics, maybe no one had ever taken them and tapped them on the shoulder and be like, maybe don't imply that the convention delegates are going to be hooking up in a kind of creepy way to your former staffer.
Well, and it's not even a former staffer. This was just a volunteer that finally got to meet the leader. And you're talking like a 50-year age gap here. You're talking, a 20-year-old girl and a 55 or a 60-year-old leader. Like, this is not, and that's not okay. Under any circumstances, even if no one had told them, it's not okay.
Yes, and this is just by way of me saying that the onus is on guys to remind their male compatriots that sometimes they're going to say things that are inappropriate, wrong, or hurtful, and are not going to, it's not going to be out of malice. It may have indeed been, playful and jocular, and they were just being stupid and ignorant. But they're never going to learn unless they are told to change.
Yeah, and it's the days of men looking the other way and saying, to the women that they care about, stay away from that man. I think those days should and must be over, and it's time for men to step forward and actually have an active part in this too.
Because if politics is a place where there is no longer toxic masculinity everywhere, everybody benefits, men and women.
There was something you mentioned about the sexual harassment appeals process in the legislature, and it appears that the biggest difference between the Ontario resignation of Patrick Brown and the resignation in Nova Scotia of Jamie Bailey is that the Nova Scotia legislature actually had a independent or at least institutionalized complaints process through which these harassment allegations went through, and Ontario was the stand standard Westminster parliamentary thing of, scurrying in the corridors and then an ultimatum in an office and then tears at a press conference and then the story was done. Which, may have a certain dramatic aspect to it, but is probably not the dependable system that employees deserve.
Absolutely, yeah. We need to have a safe system of recourse that treats everybody fairly in all workplaces, and I think this is why we're seeing a lot of this Me Too activity happening around politics, campuses, the film industry, comedy, places that don't have like a traditional workplace setup where you don't have an HR manager and you don't have regular 9 to 5 and you don't have people are working these temporary assignments and a lot of the work is about who you know and your relationships and trust, and that's fine until it's not fine, and then how do you fix the problem or investigate it. So nice to see some legislatures around Canada bringing in these kinds of these policies and processes. Patrick, you wanted to talk about another story that has a similar vein, but it's quite different.
Well, I think this plays into the idea of getting rid of of treating everyone equally and not having sort of gendered ways of treating people. And a story broke the other day that Elizabeth May is apparently quite the bully in the office. Apparently, she screams and shouts and yells and has very has very unprofessional expectations of her workforce, of her staffers. And I sort of question this is like, why is this a story when, as Rob Silver tweeted himself, that he could probably name 30%, that 30% of all MPs can be described this way. That Paul Wells wrote in his book, famously, he said, Paul Wells wrote in his last book about Stephen Harper, that Stephen Harper once shouted across a room of staffers, do I have to yell fuck to get anything done around here? Yelling leaders or yelling MPs is nothing new, and I wonder why it is that Elizabeth May is being treated differently on this than other MPs.
Right. So the Star is reporting that 3 former Green Party staffers have accused Elizabeth May of workplace bullying. And the Green Party is standing behind her and saying that she's being held to a different standard than male politicians would be held to.
And truth be told, I've heard these rumors for years from people involved in the Green Party. But I've also heard these rumors for years about, Gordon Campbell or Stephen Harper or other leaders, right?
Yes. I mean, bullying is not acceptable either.
No, it's true. It's true.
So,
Absolutely.
if the Green Party has decided that this particular moment is the time that they are going to clean house, good on them. They're going to have to do it eventually, and that is either going to result in a new leader or Elizabeth May treating her employees with more professional courtesy, because I have heard the rumors too. And that does not stop at the Green Party's borders. The Liberal Party, the Conservatives...
the New Democrats have angry MPs as well and MLAs.
There were legendary, in particular, there were legendary MLAs in the last Parliament that, on both sides, that were generally seemed to be just terrible to work for, bad for their staff, but also very well respected as legislators, in part because of how strongly they drove their staff. So
that's my question, is that we never saw news articles about any of these, but we're seeing a news article about Elizabeth May.
Well, that's because no one has thought to write the article.
Fair enough. I would applaud more of these sort of articles coming forward and ensuring, is just like everything else, that MPs and MLAs treat their staff with respect. But I sort of have an issue with the news article seeming to come out at a time when we're finally starting to pay attention to the way women are treated in the workplace, and all of a sudden there's a bit of a hatchet job against a woman in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, workplace bullying is a workplace safety issue. In British Columbia, we have legislation about bullying, and it's under our WorkSafe laws. And that's important because people deserve to be able to work in a place where they're treated with respect and there isn't hostility, etc. But you're right, it's interesting timing. It's interesting timing, and there seem to be people who are trying to draw parallels between these two stories, but it's important to recognize that bullying and sexual harassment are different things.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And calling an employee incompetent is different than calling an employee yummy, for example.
It's so creepy.
And so we shouldn't mix up these two issues.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, yeah.
Although, like, having your employer call you incompetent, like, in a public setting, I think, is another another totally unacceptable thing that...
Sure.
Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that, there are a number of explanations as to why this is coming out now. One, the writer of the story decided that this was a particularly opportune time. Two, the Green Party is staging a palace coup, which
could be happening for all we know.
I mean, it's been 12 years with Elizabeth May, and they have not moved that much in the last 10. So they might be getting tired of this situation and hopeful for another person to come up from, one of the other Green parties across Canada, which have started to be electing MLAs on a provincial level. There was a Green MLA elected in New Brunswick. We've got 3 here now. It's not an insubstantial movement.
Yeah, you're right. There's probably a lot of interesting politics behind this, and it'll be interesting to watch Green politics evolve through this. But Patrick, I think you're right. If we're going to start holding politicians accountable for bullying, it should be for everybody.
Yeah.
Men and women should not bully their staff, and we shouldn't expect women to be nice and demonize women for not being nice if we don't do the same for men.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I wonder if there can be some kind of Frank rule. You know what the Frank rule is?
Is this House of Cards?
No. Barney.
Is this the magazine?
No. Barney Frank was the representative from Massachusetts.
Oh, I know where
and
this is going.
He was gay. He was the first out member of the House in the States. And he said that it is inappropriate to out any politician for being gay unless they were using their position to negatively impact the lives of gay people. And I feel like there should be some kind of hypocrisy trigger for this.
You're right.
this
Elizabeth
thing.
May has always called for greater decorum and greater professionalism and whatnot. And so maybe this is some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like, particularly if, for example, the new minister responsible for WorkSafe BC and therefore the anti-bullying policy ends up being a very big bully, we've got kind of a flying Phil Gillardy situation.
Yes.
And because we've been asked not to do so many references and in-jokes, flying Phil Gillardy was a cabinet minister responsible for highways that was arrested for speeding a bunch.
Well, I'm sure we are going to hear lots more about #MeToo and hashtag Canadian Polly. But I think we got to move on to our next segment, which is an interview with Sheldon Goldfarb. Well, we have a very special guest today. Sheldon Goldfarb is joining us to talk about his new book, The 100-Year Trek, A History of Student Life at UBC. Sheldon is the archivist for the AMS at the University of British Columbia. That's the Alma Mater Society, or the Student Union. So he's held that post for almost 24 years now. This is his 4th book. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
This is a really, really interesting, fun look at student politics from the last 100 years at UBC. But it's not just about UBC. It's about student life. It's about youth culture. It's about the history of Vancouver. It's a great book. If you want to check out this book, you can pick it up at the UBC bookstore. You can get it online. It's on Amazon. Anywhere else?
Chapters Indigo has it online, although I'm not sure it's in the stores, but you can order it through them or Amazon.
Wonderful. Well, definitely recommend it. Sheldon, why don't we start with this? Tell us about why you wanted to write this book.
Well, I was asked to write this book. This seems to be a pattern with me. People ask me to do written stuff. And it was the president of the AMS, the Student Society, back 6-7 years ago, saying the executive had decided they wanted to do a 100th anniversary project, because we were coming up to 2015, which was the 100th anniversary of both the university and the AMS. And they said they decided they'd like to do a history book. And they thought I should be the one to write the book because, I don't know, I'd written a novel and I was the archivist, so I knew how to write and I could get access to the history. And so I began to write the book. Well, not right away. There was funding and issues and all that. Eventually we got started, and I thought it would take me a year, and I'd still finish in time for 2015, but instead it took 3 years to do the book. I spent mostly reading old copies of the student newspaper, the UBC, and the book finally came out at the end of 2017.
Wonderful. And there's so many great stories in this book. Do you want to tell us a few few that really stand out for you?
Well, we were just talking in the pre-show about the first referendum, which was about politics and political clubs at the university. And what had happened, this is right after World War II, beginning of the Cold War, and you had the Communist Party, which wasn't allowed to call itself the Communist Party anymore, or it had been banned, and it reemerged as the Labor Progressive Party. Anyway, members of it were on campus trying to distribute literature, and student council said only clubs can distribute literature. And so the Labor Progressive members said, well, we'll become a club. We'll become the Labor Progressive
Sounds like
Party
a reasonable
club.
Response.
And council said, oh, we don't have political clubs. No, we don't have any clubs that are connected to outside political parties. And then there was debate. Well, why? Why not? Okay. And then Grant Livingstone, who was a leading conservative on campus, he was in the Canadian Legion branch on campus. There were a lot of veterans on campus after World War II. And he went on to become an AMS president a couple years later. He said, wait, if the communists get a club, well, the conservatives should get a club too. And then so the council's sort of dithering. And what do? And this tells you a little bit about the nature of student power or lack of power, or their attitude towards what power they had. They went to the university's board of governors and said,
they asked for permission from parents.
They said, what should we do? And the board of governors said, this is a student issue. You decide. And
pass the buck.
And well, it's sensible. I mean, why are the students going to the board of governors saying, should we, constitute, political clubs? And so, and then the council still couldn't decide, so they had a referendum, or a plebiscite as they call it. It was the first, I've tracked back all the referendums, and this seems to be the first one. It's in 1946 or 47. And they asked the students, should we have political clubs? And the students voted 2-1, no. No politics, please. We're students.
I'm actually not surprised by that. I think if you went back and you polled students today, they'd probably say the same.
I don't know. They reversed themselves 2 years later. I think there was a general meeting which reversed the referendum and said political clubs are all right. In between, Tim Buck, the leader of the Canadian Communist Party, or I guess I should say Labor Progressive Party, was invited to campus by a left-wing but not communist group called the Social Problems Club. And
the Social Problems Club.
I think they were called the Social Problems Club, yeah. And then there was opposition. We just had a vote. We said no political clubs on campus. And the UBC newspaper pointed out, well, this is not a political club. This is an invitation for a political speaker. And so he did come to campus, although he was greeted in what at the time was a typical student way to greet controversial people. They threw their lunches at him. They hooted.
Like you do.
I don't know if they still do that. That was and although students were sort of equal opportunity when W.A.C. Bennett came to campus a few years later, they threw their lunches at him. One person threw not just like a tomato out of it, but threw the whole lunch bag. And apparently W.A.C. Bennett caught the bag and threw it back. Anyway, so they used to bother Tim Buck. Tim Buck came several times, and one time they even threw a dead cat at him, according to the UBC, which of course is always right.
Did it bounce?
Did it bounce?
Oh.
It's an illusion I'm not getting, but okay. And then there were debates like, should we allow free speech? At the time the campus was a cold. I mean, UBC over the years has reflected the politics of larger society. It was the middle of the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War, and so there were a lot of anti-communist feeling. But there were people saying, no, there should be free speech. We should let if you disagree with the communist leader, listen to him, argue back in the question period or whatever, or write an article, but don't put him down, shout him down, or throw eggs and tomatoes at him. So anyway,
it's interesting because the campus political clubs have become such a strong part of the fabric of the university, but also I think a recruitment ground for the political parties themselves. Because we were talking before this about when the federal Liberals brought Justin Trudeau onto campus to give a speech. It was standing room only in a packed room. And when I was involved in the UBC NDP club, we brought Jack Layton onto campus, and it was not quite the same standing room only, but it was a good turnout, and it sort of exposed students to the politics of the day. It seemed like a really beneficial thing to the fabric of the campus.
Well, it's become quite common now. I mean, and as I said, after 2 years they reversed themselves and they allowed political clubs. The first attempt at political clubs was back in the 30s when the council decided, well, we'll have one political club. You can all join it. Conservative, liberal, CCF, communist, and you want a political club? There's your political club. And it immediately fragmented into subdivisions.
I'm shocked.
What?
But how many different communist subdivisions did it break into? Is the question.
I think in those. I don't know. I guess they're Trotskyists, not to be confused with Trotskyites. We can talk about the Trotskyites if you want. But there was one mainstream communist party in those days. But it was interesting in the '60s when things became very very radical in the late 60s, but then it sort of died away. Stan Persky, who was one of the leading radicals, in 1970 said, we've entered the post-coital period, because it's all...
All right.
We had this explosion of radicalism, and now it's all died away. Although
they call that a period of Thermidor.
But then someone wrote in and said, but look, we have communist, Trotskyist, Maoists, IWW, and...
The Wobblies.
Yes, the Wobblies somehow re-emerged in 1970. I don't know how. Anyway, singing Joe Hill or something. But then a political science professor wrote into the UBC and said, this is not a sign of strength. This is weakness. This is fragmentation all over the place. So, and in fact, the 70s were quite a decline of the radicalism from the 60s, and you got laments for the next decade. Oh, the 60s. Where'd they go?
So one of the ways that I've kind of looked at your book is as you were saying, Erin, not only a history of students, but as a broader social history. It's like you've taken, a core sampler and delved right down over UBC students, because it really reflects the changes that are going on in society at the time. And so I was wondering if you could tell me about what you think some of the bigger inflection points are in UBC history. And I know that you were just talking about radicalism, so perhaps the occupation of the faculty lounge.
I would say yes. As I was saying, the 60s are huge. When I went into this book, I thought, and I told people, I pitched the book to people, I said, well, I'll talk about the two world wars, the Depression and the radical 60s, because I thought there's something there about the radical 60s, and I already knew. It's lore at UBC about the occupation of the faculty club in 1968, when Jerry Rubin came to campus with his pig Pegasus, who was running in the U.S. presidential election in 1968, or they were planning, the Yippies were planning to run him. Jerry Rubin was a Youth International Party representative. He came from the Chicago 7, Chicago 8, been arrested at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that year, and he came to UBC as a radical, I'm not sure who invited him, and he gave a speech talking about liberation, and you've got to, wherever you see a rule, break it, and don't be co-opted, don't accept representation on the ruling bodies, you've got to, and what you need to do more than that, you need to liberate something. What should be liberated here? And someone calls out the faculty club, and so 2,000 students marched to the faculty club and occupied it overnight, and did
they have a particular issue in mind?
Well, that's what the UBC the next day wrote. Well, what did these people want? It was sort of undefined radical activism with no particular goal.
The true left ideal.
The great UBC tradition.
Well,
what do we want? Change. How do we want it? We don't know.
And they liberated things. They liberated the liquor cabinets.
Well, like you do. That just seems like a matter of course. Yeah.
They liberated the swimming pool by going skinny dipping in it, and then they decided to liberate the music, and they brought in a band. A band performed during this overnight occupation. Meanwhile, the AMS, this was not an official AMS activity at all. The AMS president at the time was Dave Zernhelt, who went on to be an NDP cabinet minister, but he was moderate in comparison to this. And then the faculty club sent in a bill to the AMS, and the council said, well, we didn't organize. We shouldn't. But I think the AMS paid something in the end. But what was it all about? It was in the context of education reform. It was in the context of worldwide. It was Jerry Rubin. It was not just.
This was bigger than just the AMS, or even bigger than Vancouver.
It was bigger than It was bigger than UBC. The UBC president at the time, John B. McDonald, not A, said that. Society is in turmoil or ferment everywhere, and UBC is not exempt. So UBC tends to reflect what's going on. I think this is your point, Matthew, that UBC tends to reflect what's going on in the larger society. And it wasn't just this one-day occupation. There was a lot of talk about education reform being needed, more power to the students. Somebody who had presumably taken a political science course said, democracy means rule by the majority. At UBC, the majority are students, so students should rule. So I think that didn't actually happen. But what did happen as a result, this was a big turning point as a result of the 60s. Before the late 60s, you had no students on the Board of Governors, no students on the University Senate. You didn't have students on university committees. The university did not consult the students when they increased tuition or decided to do campus development or whatever. After the 60s, that all happened. And you had students on Senate, 4 right away in 67, and then some of the radicals said, that's just tokenism, that's not enough. And so the university said, oh, okay, 12, how about 12? Will 12 do? It was like the university was back on its heels. schools. So there were 12 senators who were students, still out of 80 or so. And then not till 74, when the NDP was in power provincially, did they put 2 students on the board of governors. But also they said, next time we raise tuition fees, we'll consult you. And it was like, all these things were happening. Arts 1 was invented.
They've shown up ever since, telling us that they're going to raise tuition.
And by how much, and asking if we have any questions about how much that's going to be raised.
Do you have any input? No? Yes? Really doesn't matter either way. Consultation.
But it is interesting they're talking about the universities as the incubator of students. Is the first board of governors representative was Sven Robinson.
Yes.
And controversial year that he had, but he went on to be 25 years a member of parliament. And
yes, he's one of, as I think I see where you're going with this. We have lots of students who were active in AMS politics who went on to political careers, like Sven Robinson, like Mo Sahota, like Herb Dhaliwal, like on even making it bigger, Kim Campbell, who wrote the foreword to the book, who was on council in the mid 60s. She was the first female Frosh president at UBC. We used to have a Frosh first year students president, and then later she was a vice president on the executive, but then she went on to become Prime Minister of Canada. The first
some steps in between, I think.
Well, there were some steps in between. BC politics too, but
she was a MLA for a time, wasn't she?
Yes, she ran, and then she ran for the leadership of the Social Credit Party.
And she lost
Van der Zam, I think she lost. Something like that.
It was either Van der Zam or Rita Johnson, but it must have been Van der Zam.
It was Van der Zam because Rita Johnson ran against Grace McCarthy.
Yeah, and then she was Attorney General for a while, and she had that very racy picture of her and her legal robes.
Oh yeah, that's right. They keep using that.
Mm-hmm. She was in town. I finally got to meet her, and she was giving a speech basically about her life and saying being Attorney General and Minister of Justice is the most fun you can have as a lawyer.
That's a statement. I mean, yeah.
I'm not sure she practiced much as a lawyer. Anyway, another Prime Minister was John Turner, coming from an earlier era. He was a sports writer. He was an athlete too, a sprinter, sports writer for the UBC, but then also got onto student council and became what was called coordinator of activities, which was an executive position at the time. And
coordinator of activities.
It's a vaguely Orwellian sounding title, is it?
Was there anyone else? Because it sounds like he would just be doing everything.
Hey, activities need to be coordinated.
And the first line of the AMS Constitution is the purpose of the Alma Mater Society of UBC Vancouver is to promote, direct, and control all student activities at the University of British Columbia Vancouver campus.
I think he was more in charge of dances and things like that, that organizing that sort of thing. Anyway, so he sat on AMS Council, and then he went on to he became Minister of Justice too, came back to visit the campus during the war measures crisis, the FLQ crisis, and here's another politician who was shouted down because he was defending the imposition of the War Measures Act.
Of course he would have been.
And there were students, the politics of UBC had changed because the politics had changed generally, and so there was more of a left-wing tilt, and so they were shouting down someone from the left instead of being on the right and shouting down the communist leader. And then after that he became Prime Minister, briefly. We produced brief-serving Prime Minister. Unless you count Justin Trudeau, who became Prime Minister and has been actually longer than either Kim Campbell or John Turner already.
That's true, actually.
But was not involved in AMS politics. So he's only in the book because his grandfather was in AMS politics. His grandfather was a member of Student Council, James Sinclair, whose daughter Margaret married Pierre Trudeau. So at first, when I started writing the book, James Sinclair's claim to fame was to have been the father-in-law of a prime minister. And then by the time I'd finished the book, he was also a grandfather of a prime minister. So he's a counselor who went on to produce prime ministers in a way, but I mean, not just by happenstance. James Sinclair was an important figure in liberal politics. So, which is why his daughter met Pierre Trudeau. James Sinclair was a federal cabinet minister and also I think a senator.
And he's got a building named after him downtown.
The Sinclair Building.
Sinclair Building, yeah.
Another council member from the same era ended up with a bridge named after him, so you have that to aspire to if you've been an AMS council member. Arthur Lang?
Yeah.
Arthur Lang was a member of AMS council back in the
when he was a cabinet minister?
And he became, so it's not because he was an AMS council member that they named a bridge after him. He went, that doesn't happen. He went on to also a Liberal Party, I forget, maybe a cabinet minister too. So, yeah.
Do you need to looking at the name?
No.
The book is called The 100-Year Trek. I would love if you could tell us the story of the Great Trek, because I know it's an important story if you are UBC alumni, but many of our listeners didn't go to UBC.
Of course, yes, the Great Trek of 1922, and if there's a picture of it on the cover, that's the students occupying the half-built science building in 1922 on the campus, where the campus is now, but that's not the original campus of the university. When the university that was the originally planned campus in the 19-teens, but World War I broke out, and so they couldn't finish building the campus in Point Grey, which is where it is now. So they said, well, we'll temporarily use the what became known as the Fairview Shacks by the people who had to use them. But the planners said, well, we'll use these buildings near the Vancouver General Hospital. In fact, some of the buildings belonged to the Vancouver General Hospital. They were sharing them. And just for a few years during the war, and then when the war ends, we'll finish building the campus out in Point Grey, and you go there. So World War I ended in 1918. By 1922, the students were saying, well, where's this campus? And it wasn't just the students. This was a protest that had widespread support, faculty, administration, the Vancouver papers like The Sun and The Province, the Board of Trade, everybody except the government, it seemed, thought the government should pay the money and finish building the campus because the province needed a proper campus for its University of British Columbia. But things were dragging on. The students started a petition, got over 50,000 signatures, and then decided to have a march. And they marched, they started at the old campus, 10th and Oak, near the VGH. They went downtown, they marched along Georgia Street. The students were marching, they had supporters in cars, they also had floats with things saying, they had a big picture of a sardine can and saying, we're packed like sardines, we need, more space. And then they jumped on streetcars, the men jumped on one streetcar, the women jumped on another, I don't know why. But
the 20s were a different time.
Yeah, one went to Alma, one went to Sasamat, which was the end of the line, and then they marched the rest of the way.
Oh, that's better than that.
They marched from Sasamat or Alma and met up at the campus, at the building, and they climbed up into the building. Some people look at the picture we have of this building and say, wouldn't be allowed now. There were no barriers, but no one fell off, apparently.
That's good.
No one died, no one was hurt. They clambered up and they raised their banner saying, build the university, and there's a cheerleader. I don't know if the cheerleader can be seen at a male cheerleader. No, those are on the far right. I don't know if it was cut out of the picture on the cover. A Yell leader. We have film of this. Actually, someone filmed this back in 1922. It's on the AMS website if you want to check it out. Transformed to video. And anyway.
The website is ams.ubc.ca.
Yes, it is. And they also formed into 3 giant letters. All the students, the whole student body, all the accounts say everybody showed up. So, okay, I have to take that.
Sure, everybody. I'm sure they were taking attendance and very carefully monitoring that.
There were only 1,200 students in those days, a much smaller university. Now there's 50,000 plus. But anyway, there were 1,200 then. The reports say everybody showed up for what was called the pilgrimage then. It was the pilgrimage up to West Point Grey. And only in later years it became known as the Great Trek. And so besides filling the building, they formed into 3 giant letters, a U, a B, and a C. And there's a iconic picture of that too. And the government saw the point, as the UBC student newspaper said, making a little pun, and brought, paid up the $1.5 million, which is what was needed in 1922 to build a whole campus. Now it wouldn't be even a corner of the student union building.
You'd have to add some zeros for that.
And then eventually, 1925, that science building was finished. The main library was finished, which is now the I.K. Barber Center, and a few other buildings. Some semi-permanent buildings were built, which were supposed to last a decade or so, and some of them are still in use.
That seems to have been UBC's standard for...
Like geography and math annex.
Geography and math annex. The old auditorium, which was built then, and it's still going... They instead of tearing it down, they renovated it. And that's the Great Trek.
And you make the point in your book about how often students have got together to raise funds, made donations, or pushed to make buildings happen, to renovate or to build their own spaces.
Yes, Norman Mackenzie, who was a president of the university, said, no university in the world that I know of owes as much to its students as does the University of British Columbia. And I think he meant in the sense of money. I mean,
interesting.
Because as you say, the students raised money to build the first student union building in 1940, which became Brock Hall. They then, when that
so they just loaned it out to be the administration building afterwards.
Well, the students students handed it back to, or handed it over to the, well, it was owned by the university, but it was used by the students from 1940 to 1968 and then handed back to the university, which is what's happening now with the old, what's called the old sub, which was the new sub in 1968. It was built then. The students moved in there, building that because the campus was growing. It wasn't any more 1,200 students or 2,000 students like it was in 1940 when they built the Brock Hall. It was into 10, 15,000. So they said, let's build something really big. It could hold even 20,000 students. And by the time
that'll last them a solid
year.
Yep.
By the first year the building was built, it was already 20,000 students. So then the students raised money. So the students raised their fees. AMS fees were raised to pay for the Student Union building of 1968, and raised their fees again in a referendum 2008 to pay for the new sub, now called the AMS Student Nest, and handed over the old sub. Most of it's being handed over to the university. Same process.
And as a nice piece of trivia, I was the elections administrator for that referendum.
Well, there you go.
I got to administer the process and ensure democracy was free and fair, and that everyone voted to significantly increase the fees on future students to build a building.
That was an interesting time. That was the time of the Trek Art protest and the bonfire. Mm-hmm. So there were some very activist students pushing against the university's plans to build high-rise condos in the middle of campus all around the old sub and retail and all that sort of stuff. They were pushing back in a sort of radical way. The AMS leadership also wanted to push back, and what they did was have this referendum, and were able to go to the university and say, not just, we don't want you to build that stuff there, we're raising money, we can guarantee $85 million towards something different in the middle of campus, a new student union building, and that seemed to win the day. I mean, the VP students, the university's vice president of students, Brian Sullivan, came to council and said, wow, you've blown us away, so we're going to take this very seriously, and indeed, that's what's at the center of campus. How about there's condos around?
And future condos and more. Yeah.
Quite possible.
So there was a lot of controversy over that area, that development process. There was like an underground bus loop that was proposed, and now it's home to the Eco Stream and the Alumni Center and the Student Union process. And all that has happened in a period from 2008 to roughly now. What other changes have you seen happen in the university during not only that time, I guess, but your time that you spent working for the AMS?
Well, starting just before my time, we talked about condos. There didn't used to be condos on campus. That began with Hampton Place in 1989. And this stems from, you can understand where the university was coming from, because in the early 80s, this was a time of some radical student protest, but in a very reactive way. It was the time, if this was Bill Bennett, I think, or was it WAC?
No, Bill Bennett would have been from
82, 83?
75 to 85, I think.
Okay.
So this will be Solidarity and...
The Solidarity movement, because what the social credit government was doing was cutting back. Restraint was the watchword. It was a time of recession, so there might have been some reason for this, but they were doing these serious cutbacks affecting not just education, but other sectors of society, and there were protests against this because the university was not providing enough funding, and the president at the time, so what the first reaction of the president of the UBC president at the time, George Peterson, was to cut back programs. They were shutting down programs and letting professors go, even tenured professors, which you can't usually do, but if you say, well, we're not going to offer this program anymore, so sorry, there is no job. And then the faculty association didn't like that, and the students didn't like the cutbacks, and tuition fees were being raised, a lot of pressure, but there still wasn't enough money, and the result was George Peterson resigned, one of the several university presidents to resign unexpectedly. Most recent was Arvind Gupta. But anyway, George Peterson resigned sort of in principle, saying, I can't run a university this way. You're not funding me, so you're not funding the university, so I can't do it. So he was gone, and in came David Strangway. And David Strangway had a different approach. Rather than go with more fees or cutbacks, he said his idea was to look for alternative sources of funding. And one of those was to do campus development, condos, bring in money that way. And so although some people said, well, you're commercializing the university and that, it was a response to, like, where do we get the money? If you don't want us to raise your fees. Anyway, so condos began with Hampton Place, and so it's changed dramatically. So now you have Westbrook Village, which is full of condos and retail, and I'm sure the first president of the university, Frank Westbrook, had that in mind. When I'll start a university and it'll be full of banks and retail stores, or maybe not. Anyway, so that's a big change that's happened at the university since the late 80s, the David Strangway era. And he also, besides that, he did also build academic buildings and things like the Chan Center and what else went up? Well, there was the Walter C. Kerr Turner Library went up during his time. And so he did build a lot of academic buildings. Some students said it's too much focus on bricks and mortar and not on improving instruction at the university, and which was a big thing in the 60s too. One of the things they demanded was no more dull lectures. And I thought, well, there's something to get behind, and I'm not sure how you ensure that, but there you go.
Have you seen a change to the way student politics looks and feels, or the way student life works as a result of that development on campus?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? It didn't really catch.
Oh, sorry. Have you seen, since that campus development has started under Strangway, a change to student life, or the look and feel of student politics at UBC?
Student politics in the last couple of decades has ebbed and flowed. There's been moments of radical activism, like as early as the Solidarity movement in the early 80s, and then, but there hasn't been, I wouldn't have said the focus. There's been occasional protests against, and I don't mean big marches, there's been occasional objections to condos and that on campus, and of course objections to putting condos at the center of campus, and which led to the bonfire and the Trek Park protest. But I would say it's gone up and down. The late 80s saw a bit more activism to the formation of the Student Environment Center, environmentalism, sustainability. That was a radical position in the 80s. Now it's mainstream, so it's like there's nothing more for them to do in a way. It also became, it was also the time when something called the Global Development Center was created, and it changed its name later to the Social Justice Center. So there was a little rise of activism in the late 80s. Then there was some more, so a bit then, there was in 1997 when APEC came to campus, students protested against that. It was sort of reactive. And then you saw the activism of Trek Park and the buildings on campus, and also at the same time there was the famous UN Gate thing and Vote to Gaza. I don't know if that's active. That was sort of Middle Eastern activism comes to campus, because UBC is of course the place where we can solve the Middle East crisis. But in a way it reflects, UBC is part of the world and it reflects the larger world. I would say for the most part in the past few decades there's been more an approach of negotiating with the university, diplomacy, lobbying. This became a big debate after the 60s, or even during the 60s into the 70s. Are we here mostly to fight the man and be radicals, or is our main aim to provide services for our members? And that was more the route that was taken after the 60s. Like, we'll start services, we'll introduce the U-Pass, we'll introduce the health and dental plan, we'll introduce Safe Walk. That's the walk, escorting across campus in the nighttime so people can be safe. And we'll start things like a pizza place and other food outlets, although the university objected mightily to that and said, no, it's our job to sell pizza. I don't know if they used those words, but it was like that. No, we have a pizza place. You can't have a pizza place.
Great debates.
The true issues of our time.
But that's, I would say, the focus of the AMS in the past 2 decades. There's been moments of activism, but on the whole, it's more, let's provide services for our members. Let's negotiate with the university. We will provide documentation to show why these are the wrong benchmarks to use if you're talking about tuition fees. A lot of research. I would say the AMS became very professional. Something I talk about in the book. The AMS became very professional in this century. So that's where it's moved.
So interesting.
It's interesting that the university would say, it's our job to sell pizza, and you must decide whether politics are allowed.
Right, yeah. An interesting division of power.
Yeah.
Different eras, though.
Yeah.
Reading this book, there's a lot of demands that students make, and they express their needs. We need transit, we need housing, we need a subsidy or grants. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to weigh in on what a healthy democracy needs from students. What do students contribute for a democratic system?
Do you mean the democratic system on the university campus, or more broadly?
More
Okay.
broadly.
Society?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating question. Like, universities, I think we've sort of, in the 21st century, we've sort of come to this conclusion that universities are not degree mills, but places to improve the economy via the passing on of knowledge and degrees, and depoliticize them to a large degree. But I think, like you were saying, Sheldon, is, in the 60s, everyone was getting very active on the university campuses for all sorts of things. In the mid-2000s, again, we saw that when we were there, was the resurgence of the left, as well as other issues. But I think it's just going to move my cat. But I think it's an interesting sort of question is like, what element does that have? Because that is sort of the youth moving forward that are going to become the leaders of parties, or going to become the people that are going to be in politics later, but they're also the people that are pressuring today. Like the APEC riot that occurred, as well as a whole host of other political activities that have happened over the years. I think it's a really vital process.
I mean, from students as a whole, I think one of the most important things that students can give is their votes. Voter turnout remains frustratingly low.
Well, not in the last BC or federal elections. Both of those, youth turnout was significantly spiked over previous elections into levels that are actually quite, actually respectable.
It's still the lowest it was still the lowest turnout of all the demographics.
But it's always been the lowest turnout of the demographics.
Yes.
Youth voter turnout is no different amongst today's youth than it was amongst baby boomer youth.
And it's any wonder that governments would decide to put off funding for a university as opposed to pouring more money into hospitals, because the people who want the university aren't showing up to vote at the ballot box.
That's true. Yeah.
So, the democracies need participation from students. They need time and engagement and critical thought from students, because they're the people who are in this cauldron of new thought and new ideas that are able to come up with innovative new solutions for, the challenges to come, especially since those people are going to probably be the leaders that are going to, take the province forward as those challenges reach crisis point.
Well, in the 60s, as early as that, they were talking about, it's more than the university. We want to change society. And that was a very radical time. And I'm not sure. I mean, there's enough trouble getting the students engaged. Apathy is a theme one of the themes in the book, although it's a negative term. There was pushback also. The book mostly is written from the point of view of the AMS leadership, because I took it from the student newspaper and they were quoting. But the student newspaper also got letters from ordinary students saying, in response to the leaders saying, come to the football game. That was the 20s or 30s, or even now. Or join the protest, and the students would write and say, I'm here to get a degree. I'm studying. Leave me alone. And it's not apathy. I've chosen what I'm interested. These are my priorities. I don't want to go vote in your election, so please and I don't want to go to I don't want to march in demonstration to change society. I want to learn how to fit into society. So this is not a radical student writing in. Or people just said, we've got better things to do. And even one of the presidents said, well, there's such thing as positive apathy. They've just, they're off doing their own thing, and they're joining clubs, which is a way of participating. A lot of, clubs are a big deal at university, and that was a big thing. But there's this constant tension. You can see it as early as the 20s or even before, with the AMS leadership saying, get involved, join a club, come to the ball game, learn the cheers, politically incorrect cheers, which we cannot repeat now. But anyway, and the student, and if you don't do that, you don't even belong here. And some of the students saying, oh, go away. Or the newspaper would say, don't be a satchel slave, which meant someone who's just with their books all the time. And, be well-rounded, join a club. But it didn't work all the time. And so the paper would say, oh, well, the student body, where's the student body? They're all studying in the library. What kind of students are these?
Stupid students. All they do is study and do their studies and courses. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, it sort of speaks to this expectation that students are going to be engaged and they're going to be out there pushing for a better society and being this incubator for radical new ideas. Not everybody is going to be into that, and that's okay.
Yeah.
At the same time, students do play a really important role. I'm thinking about the students in and the role they played in the Arab Spring, for example. That's very radical and has incredible amount of change. Same thing in many parts of Canada. You point out in this book, you talk about David Suzuki and environmental movement that was maybe not started at UBC, but certainly nurtured there, as well as the fact that the AMS, the student union, launched the first women's studies course at UBC for no credit.
Yes, this
I
was.
didn't know about that one.
Oh yes, so feminism. So as I think I was saying, maybe I wasn't saying. Anyway, last year we talked about the 100th anniversary of of women getting the vote in BC, and because it was 1917, but women were voting in AMS elections from the beginning, and even elected a woman president in 1917. So the same year when they were first getting the vote in provincial elections, they were already electing a woman president at the university. And there's been a tradition of of that, women have been involved in the leadership of the AMS, although there wasn't another woman president until 1951, and that was sort of by accident as the male president resigned, and the Constitution had a quirk which said if the president's gone, the president of the Women's Undergraduate Society, which was a thing then, becomes president. And people said, oh, a woman president? And then when she'd finished her term and done very well, she did well for a woman, and yes, and then they changed the rules so that wouldn't happen again. And there wasn't a woman elected president until the 80s. But then there was a long run of women being elected president. But even before that, you're talking about women's studies. There wasn't a women's studies program at UBC in the 60s or 70s. And the radical human government executive of the students of the AMS pushed for let's do some women's studies courses. And I think it was Ann Petrie who went on to be a CBC personality. She's the one who started up the first women's studies course, and it was given by the AMS as a non-credit, unofficial course. And they did that for I think 2 years, and then the university finally said, this is typical. The AMS often is starting something, and then the university picks it up. And then after that, the university started a women's studies program, or women's studies courses, and then eventually it turned into a program. I'm not sure if it's a major now. It's changed its name too.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know.
Yeah, it's gender studies, I think, now at UBC. But there have been a long string of women presidents at the AMS as well, which I hadn't really considered as part of that. But yeah, it's a really neat concept.
Starting in the 80s and through the 90s, and there was a drought after we abolished slates, political parties, and for a while, and people said that's why, if there's no political parties running in the elections, you can't get women elected president. But now, since then, we've had 2 more women presidents, so not sure that's true. But yeah, and there's been years when 4/5 of the student executive were female, and so it ebbs up.
So, university can be about more than studying and changing the world. It can also be about partying. And you mentioned in here the RCMP crackdown on beer gardens and the war on fun. I was wondering if you could tell us a little about what has happened to the university over the last 15 years or so.
15. We can go further back than that. The AMS used to be dry. The AMS used to be a prohibitionist organization back in the 20s, 30s, 40s.
Really?
Yes, students didn't drink, Well, actually, I'm sure they did drink, but officially they didn't drink. And there was even a rule you weren't allowed to show up at a party, a dance, a ball, with liquor on your breath. Someone got fined $25 for showing up at the Aggies ball in the 1930s or something because they smelled of liquor and they were obviously intoxicated. So they were fined $25 was a lot of money. And then it was like almost the same as your student fee. And so, but that changed, I guess, in the 60s, and students wanted to drink, but it didn't change quick enough. When they built the Student Union Building in 1968, they did a long questionnaire asking students, do you want a bowling alley? Do you want a record listening lounge? Do you want do you want this sort of food outlet? Do you want couches? They didn't ask if they wanted a pub. They didn't even think, it wasn't even on there.
Left it blank.
It wasn't, no, but it wasn't even a question asked. It wasn't on the radar of the student leadership, and so no, they didn't ask the students, so the students didn't answer. And so they built the Student Union Building in 1968 with no pub. But by that time, some students had discovered alcohol and were wanting to drink, and were saying there should be a pub in the Student Union Building, and to show what we want, we're going to go sit, they had a pub in. So this is the same year as the occupation, it was the 60s. So you have demonstrations and sit-ins for everything. So this was a pub in the Student Union Building, I think a month before the occupation of the faculty club. So
wasn't David Suzuki a big organizer of the pub process?
He didn't. Yes, he was very much involved in this. He didn't organize the pub in, and the same future NDP cabinet minister who was president of the AMS that year, Dave Zernhelt, said the people sat in the sub drinking illegally. There was no liquor license. There was no bar. They were just sitting on the floor or in front of the building or inside the building drinking, and you're not allowed to do that, especially under the liquor laws of those days. And Dave Zernhelt said, no, please don't do that. We're working on getting a liquor license, which they did. And meanwhile, David Suzuki had already published an article in the university administration's paper in UBC Reports saying what this campus needs is a pub, and going on at great length about the benefits of this, because this would mean that students and their professors could carry on the discussions that they began in class in the pub.
That's a good logic.
I'm not sure that ever really happened, but sure, philosophy, physics, whatever, sociology, let's discuss it in the pub over a beer, much more informal. Anyway, he wrote this article. He was, so he was supporting the notion that there should be a pub for students and not just the faculty club liquor cabinets. And so the students created a committee committee to look into putting a pub into the sub, the Student Union building, and they said, well, we'll put David Suzuki. And David Suzuki was a professor. He was not a student.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought he was a student.
No, David Suzuki was not a student at the time. David Suzuki was a professor, a young professor of biology who was known for his innovative teaching methods, including, let's have an exam overnight. You stay overnight. I'm going home, but you stay and do your exam. I'll pick it up in the morning. And or let's have a class at the Fraser Arms pub. See, he really
That's
believed
where my parents met. I'm not even joking.
in his class.
No, but at the Fraser Arms pub. But maybe his class was happening at the time. I'm not sure.
Anyway, so he was, and so this was a time of some innovation, like Arts One started then, and he was innovative, and he was also pushing for a pub for students. And so the students said, okay, here's a faculty member who's an ally. Let's name him to our committee. So the opposite of the university naming a student to this is the students naming a professor to a committee. And if you look in the minutes of the committee on building a pub in the sub, it says D. Suzuki suggested that the name of the pub be the Pit. So he came up with the name the Pit Pub, which is still the name for the pub. And so the AMS moved pretty rapidly from being a prohibitionist organization to an organization that actually sold liquor. So they changed the rules and said it was okay if you drank.
I guess you'd have to change that rule if you're going to be running a pub.
Yes, you know. So the pub was around for many years, but the period Matthew was talking about is a time when some student leaders were concerned because besides the pub, there were then beer gardens, which couldn't be called beer gardens because of, well, some people interpreted the law this way. You couldn't put a sign up saying beer gardens. So they spelled it B-Z-Z-R. I don't know how you pronounce that. Bizarre? Zier. Anyway, but there were beer gardens around, and you can get a special occasion license to run your beer garden from the RCMP on campus, which was in charge of that. I don't know why really, but and then it was felt by some leaders that the RCMP was putting obstacles in the way of students, like art students or the graduate students or whoever wanted to have a beer garden. And there was talk that there's a war on fun, which the university denied. No, of course we don't want to return to a dry campus. But anyway, for some years there was talk of that, and then that eased away, and I think that's gone away. And so I don't hear any complaints about war on fun now.
Are there as many beer gardens happening now as there were 15 years ago?
This is something I have not tracked down, but perhaps your lovely podcast people can go
do
some
census.
research.
Yeah. Actually, I'm sure these SOLs are
Public information.
record.
It'll be easily identifiable, but yeah, it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, you could go to the RCMP probably and ask for the number of permits. I think there have been people who've done that. So
Yeah, a friend of ours has done some of that compiling, and we could probably look into it.
And now the latest thing is there was talk of building a brew pub or a microbrewery on campus. This happened in the last few, so it's at the very end of the book, or almost the very end of the book. There's talk of building a brewery there. That still hasn't come to pass, but so.
So wasn't a referendum passed to provide money for this?
A referendum was passed, yes, in the last couple of years that I talk about, to build a brewery somewhere, maybe on the UBC farm, maybe at first they were going to try to put it in the new sub, the student nest, but it was conditional on agreements being reached with the university and, I don't know, the province, and things are still being negotiated. So the end of that, not in the book. There are some things that'll have to wait for the next one.
Well,
That's really interesting.
Time marches onward.
Sheldon, any last words that you want to leave us with?
It was fun writing the book, and I think it'd be fun for people to read the book, so I encourage people to go read the book.
Yeah, I have the book next to all my other Vancouver history books. I've got a bit of a small library. I think it's just a fascinating glimpse into not just the history of UBC, but I think you can read so much into the rest of the history of Vancouver and British Columbia out of it. Just a really neat read.
I will mention that Patrick lent me a copy of the Chuck Davis History of Vancouver, which in a way is a model. Like the same as Chuck Davis's History of Vancouver, I go year by year. It's a sort of chronicle, and I do little snippets. So it's not a continuous like textbooky sociological analysis. It's like, oh, Great Trek, or occupation of the faculty club, or whatever, engineering pranks. So we didn't even talk about engineering pranks. Anyway, so it sort of follows I've talked about that in other interviews. So it follows the Chuck Davis model, and so that was a useful thing to look at. And so I hope people enjoy and have fun finding out stuff about the history of students at UBC.
There we go.
All right, well, the book is The 100-Year Trek, A History of Student Life at UBC by Sheldon Goldfarb. Sheldon, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you here.
I enjoyed it too.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
AMS politics is a big reason why the three of us are friends. So it's been a really fun hour to just spend remembering those moments at UBC and thinking about the difference it can make to be a part of a student organization.
I'm afraid I took your whole hour.
We'll figure that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate you spending the time with us.
No, it was fun.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. Let's wrap up this episode by reminiscing. I'm wondering, what is your favorite UBC story? Matthew, are you ready to start?
Yeah, my favorite UBC story is the Great Campus Washout, which happened in the mid-1930s.
You remember it well.
Yes, yeah. I remember it because once a candidate was running on a drainage issue, and this is the one time where drainage was a serious problem on campus, because basically everything from where Gage Towers are today all the way out to Cecil Greenhouse and Tower Beach was in a very serious storm washed out to sea. A giant ravine carved a huge hole into campus, and it took hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair.
Amazing. Patrick?
So I thought we were going to be talking about our favorite memories of
Sure.
UBC.
Yeah.
So my favorite memory has got to be going to Arts County Fair on the last day of classes.
You remember Arts County Fair?
I remember at least until noon or 1 p.m. And, we would hang out and get together and sort of celebrate the end of the year. And I thought that was a great tradition.
My least favorite memory at UBC was the meeting where we killed Arts County Fair.
Yeah. And yours?
Well, this talk about UBC has made me think about a day when I think I was a first year, and I was at the sub outside on the plaza, and I was there to sell Arts County Fair tickets. This is tickets for the big rock concert at the end of the year. At the same time, there was about 6 other student protests all happening at the same time. So there was a big, the pro-life movement that they put up the big posters comparing abortion to
big genocide awareness project.
Genocide awareness project.
Yeah.
So they were there with their business, and then all the pro-choice, women's center people were there surrounding them. So all of that was happening. At the same time, we were trying to get people to buy tickets to our rock concert, and then on top of that, the AMS, the student government, was holding a anti-tuition raising rally, and they had printed these posters with the president of the university superimposed over the body of Marie Antoinette, and their slogan was "Let them eat cake." And they had a giant sheet cake, and they were serving free cake to all the students.
Wow!
And I was in first year, and I was just like, "Wow!" My little political brain was exploding. It was a really formative moment.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so anyway, thanks for the great episode, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with all your friends. We are Pod Keep Our Land. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
UBC, our city. Rah, rah, rah. Fight, 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 for we wear the blue and gold of the victors. We are the men of the UBC. All other teams acknowledge us masters. We are strong in adversity.
There's work for the day and work for the morrow. We are the ones who will do our share. Shouting in joy and silent in sorrow. Bravery conquers fear. Hail UBC, our glorious university. You stand for I, between the mountains and the sky. All through life's way, let's sing Claroya varsity. To a mess wins the day, and we'll push on to victory.
UBC, our glorious university.
You stand for all